There's a specific kind of discouragement that shows up about 2 months into this work. Not the discouragement of not trying, the discouragement of trying and finding that things are harder, not easier. That some relationships feel more strained, not less. That you still said yes last Tuesday and you knew exactly what you were doing and you did it anyway. Nobody in the recovery content you've been consuming warned you about this part. Not because it doesn't exist, but because most of what gets made about people-pleasing recovery is about the before and the after. The recognition, the breakthrough, the transformation, and almost nothing about the middle. This video is about the middle. 6 things that are actually happening when recovery gets strange and hard, named precisely enough, hopefully, that you stop reading the difficulty as evidence that you're failing. Because you're not failing. You're just in a part of this that nobody drew a map for. The first thing nobody tells you. When you start interrupting the fawn response, your body registers it as danger. Not metaphorical danger, actual, physiological, something is wrong danger. Because for years, maybe decades, making yourself agreeable, shrinking yourself down, saying yes before you checked in with yourself, that was the safety strategy. Your nervous system learned it worked, and now you're interfering with it. So when you hold a boundary for the first time, or pause before the automatic yes, or let a silence sit instead of filling it, something in your chest tightens. Your heart rate changes. There's a low-level alarm that runs underneath the interaction. This is not anxiety about doing something wrong. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, flagging the interruption of the survival pattern as a threat. It does not mean you are in danger. It means you are changing. The second thing, the guilt gets worse before it gets better. This one surprises people the most. You expect to feel guilty before recovery. That's the pattern. The guilt was always there, running quietly underneath everything. What you don't expect is to feel more guilty once you start trying to change. But here's what's actually happening. Before recovery, the guilt was ambient, background noise. Now you're paying attention. You're more aware of the moment the guilt activates. You're watching it with new eyes. So it doesn't feel bigger because it's growing. It feels bigger because you're finally in the room with it. And there's something else. Every time you do interrupt the pattern, every time you say no or hold something back or protect your time, the guilt arrives as a verdict. See? You're selfish. See? You hurt them. See? This is why you couldn't do it. That verdict is not information. It is the old pattern trying to pull you back into compliance. Guilt, in recovery from this, is not a sign that you did something wrong. It is a sign that you did something different. Those are not the same thing. And that brings us to the third thing nobody tells you. Some relationships get harder when you start recovering. Not all of them, but some, and often, the ones that matter most. Here's the mechanism. Every relationship you've been in has been calibrated, over time, to a particular version of you. The version that says yes. The version that absorbs conflict. The version that manages the emotional temperature of every room. That version of you made certain dynamics possible. When you begin to change, when you start declining things or holding your ground or simply being present in a way that doesn't involve constant management of everyone else, the dynamic has to shift too. Some people in your life will shift with you. Some will resist, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but the relationship was built on a particular load-bearing wall, and you are quietly removing it. And some of what you thought was connection turns out to have been function. That is one of the hardest discoveries in this process. The fourth thing, and this one doesn't get named enough, is grief. Not the grief of losing someone to death or distance. The grief of people who are still present, still in your life, and whom you are slowly realizing cannot meet you in the place you're trying to get to. There's a very specific loneliness in sitting across from someone who loves you, who has always loved you, and understanding that what they love is a version of you that you are trying, carefully, slowly, to stop being. This is grief. Real grief. And almost no one in the recovery space names it directly, because it's complicated. Because you're not supposed to grieve people who are still there, because the narrative is supposed to be liberation, not loss. But recovery from people-pleasing involves loss. Loss of the familiar. Loss of the role. Loss of the certainty that comes with always knowing exactly what you're supposed to do next. Letting yourself know that, letting yourself grieve it, is not weakness. It is the most honest part of the process. The fifth thing nobody tells you. The self comes back slowly. And strangely, Most of the content about recovering the authentic self frames it as a revelation, a moment of clarity, a day when you wake up knowing what you want. That is not how it happens for most people. What actually happens is quieter and harder to trust. A preference surfaces while you're doing something ordinary. You notice that you don't want something, not as a performance of not wanting, not as an attempt to set a limit, but as a genuine, uncomplicated no. You spend an hour doing something that has nothing to do with anyone else's needs, and you don't feel guilty about it. These moments don't announce themselves. They arrive sideways, and because they're small, because they don't look like the transformation you were expecting, you might not even recognize them. But those moments, the quiet, ordinary, undramatic ones, are what recovery actually looks like. Not the Instagram version, the real one. The sixth thing is the one that reorganizes all the others. There is no finish line. There is no state called recovered that you arrive at and then inhabit permanently. The fawn response doesn't disappear. The nervous system doesn't forget its training. What changes, what actually changes, is the space between the trigger and the yes. That space starts as almost nothing, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. Over time, it grows, not because you've healed some wound completely, but because you've practiced something different enough times that the nervous system begins slowly, cautiously, to learn that a different response is survivable. Recovery is not the destination. It is the condition you start living in. And that reframe matters. Because if you've been waiting to feel finished, waiting to feel like the work is complete, waiting for the day when none of this is hard anymore, you will keep measuring yourself against an arrival point that doesn't exist. The measure is not, am I there yet? The measure is the space getting wider? Even slightly. Even slowly. Even in the weeks when it doesn't feel like it is. If you're somewhere in the middle of this, if today's video names something you've been living without language for, there's a structured 8-week process in the description that holds the full arc of this journey. Not a shortcut. Not a fix. A framework that takes you from understanding why you got here, through the daily practice of interrupting the pattern, to the slow work of building an identity that doesn't depend on being needed. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. So, you're in the middle. Things are harder than you expected. Some relationships are strained. The guilt is louder than it was before you started paying attention. The self hasn't arrived in the clear, announced way you were hoping for. Here is what to do with that. The first thing, name the surprise. When recovery delivers something unexpected, when the guilt spikes, when a relationship gets complicated, when the self doesn't show up where you thought it would, name what just surprised you. Not to analyze it immediately, just to acknowledge it. I didn't expect this to hurt this much. I didn't expect the relationship to resist. I didn't expect to feel lonelier. In some ways, naming the surprise separates you from it slightly. It interrupts the spiral from this is hard to this is proof I'm failing. Those are different things. And naming keeps them different. The second thing, separate discomfort from regression. Discomfort in recovery is not a symptom of moving backwards. In most cases, it is the opposite. The guilt that arrives when you hold a boundary is your nervous system flagging a pattern interruption. The grief that surfaces when a relationship shifts is a sign that you are, in fact, changing, and that the relationship is registering the change. The difficulty is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is frequently a sign that something has gone right. Uncomfortable and wrong are not the same thing. Sit with that for a moment, because most people in this pattern have spent so long managing everyone else's discomfort that their own discomfort has become evidence, automatic, unquestioned evidence of failure. It isn't. The third thing, find the evidence. When the inner critic says you haven't changed at all, ask for proof. Not proof that you've changed completely. Not proof that the pattern is gone. Proof of the space. Did I pause before the yes even once this week? Did I feel the guilt and not immediately overgive to make it stop? Did I let someone be disappointed, even briefly, without collapsing? These are not small things. They are the only things. Recovery is built in those moments, not in the eventual state they're building toward. You are not starting over every time it gets hard. You are continuing. That distinction, held clearly, is what makes it possible to keep going. If what's in the description can hold the rest of this journey for you, the map for the middle, and everything after it, the link is there when you're ready. So is the pinned comment. Which of these 6 things surprised you the most? And is there one you're living right now that you didn't have a name for until today? The self you've been looking for, is not gone. It is not waiting on the other side of a finish line. It is here, showing up in the small, undramatic moments. In the preference that surfaces without announcing itself. In the no that comes out with slightly less bracing than the last one. In the hour you spent doing something that was entirely yours. Recovery from this is not the same as becoming someone new. It is slower and stranger than that. It is more like remembering than building. And the middle, this part you're in right now, the part that nobody drew a map for, is not proof that you've gotten it wrong. It is proof that you are actually in it, not watching from the outside, not reading about it. In it, the body getting louder and the guilt arriving as a verdict and the relationships recalibrating and the grief being real. These are not signs of failure. They are the texture of actual change. They are what it costs. And the fact that you are here, still paying attention, still trying to understand what's happening, still unwilling to stop, says something. Not about how far you've come, about what you're made of. This doesn't get fixed in a month or a year or probably even longer than that. The self you've been slowly putting down over years doesn't come back all at once, but it does come back. Not as someone you have to become, as someone you recognize, someone who existed before you learned that existing like that wasn't safe. That person is still here, not as a destination, as a direction. And that is not optimism. That is just what recovery actually looks like.